to the Policy Center for the New South's webinar on the role that civil society and civil society organizations are playing in the fight against the coronavirus. COVID-19 is an urgent health crisis that will also have massive global social and economic repercussions with ripple effects that are perhaps still even difficult for us to grasp at this stage. Governments and the private sector around the world have put in place measures to help contain the spread of the virus and reduce the pressure on the health system, ultimately to help flatten the curve. Alongside government and private sector action, we've been seeing the amplification of civil society activity around the world to either strengthen government action or fill in gaps in areas where governments as well as the private sector have not been able to perform, making civil society a key actor in collective social action. Across borders, CSOs have been contributing to and leading awareness and information campaigns, educational support, food distribution. They've been tackling misinformation, putting pressure on international organizations, mobilizing medical supplies, advocating for fund allocation, and so much more. Let's just say that facing and dealing with this pandemic and its impact is truly a collective effort. And civil society organizations are playing a major role in that regard. Against this backdrop, this webinar will address ways in which civil society is helping and can contribute to help governments and the private sector around the world drive an effective response to the COVID-19 health emergency. We are very happy to welcome to this discussion today a very sharp panel of speakers from different parts of the world who will be helping us understand the multifaceted nature of CSO action, as well as the very local dimensions of their involvement. I'm very pleased to welcome Wadia Ethinza, who's the head of the Global Shapers at the World Economic Forum, Alexandra Shmilevska, Coordinator of Projects and Fundraising at the European Institute of the Mediterranean, Faye Cowper, who's the National Coordinator at Duartec, and she will be telling us more about this initiative shortly, and Ibrahim Sanusi, who is Senior Advisor for Citizens Participation and Innovation Data Use for Africa's Development, a joint African Union and GIZ project. In my capacity as coordinator of the Atlantic Dialogue's Emerging Leaders Program at the Policy Center, I would also like to highlight that 3 of our 4 speakers today are alumni of the Emerging Leaders Program. So Wedi, Alexandra, Faye, and Ibrahim, thank you all so much for accepting our invitation and for being here with us today. I will start off with a general question linked to the introductory comments. And you can either address this question by referring to the work you are doing, if appropriate, or what you are seeing around you, and we'll just take it from there. So the first question would be, in addition to the role that governments and the private sector are playing, what role is civil society playing in facing this pandemic, generally speaking? And I guess, Wedi, I'll give you the floor first.
Thanks, Lilia. Thanks to the Policy Center for the New South for this webinar, which is of utmost importance because a lot of people lately saw an emerging or a more crucial role of the state that is growing very big day by day as this pandemic unfolds its tentacles. But the civil society has a crucial role in this pandemic. As you stated in your introductory remarks, the civil society had an important role, and with this pandemic, it even gets bigger. Like, for example, one of the main aspects where we saw a beautiful work done by the civil society across the world is tackling with the fake news. As the state, as the WHO, as the scientific community releases important information that are concerning our health and the health of a lot of people, unfortunately, fake news are appearing at so many levels. And the civil society helped because the state doesn't have time or the resources to tackle such an issue. Business is the same. Civil society was on the top front of tackling such important issue and delivering the key information to the citizens. This is one of the aspects where we saw the flourishing number of campaigns, of projects, initiatives by associations, NGOs, local, national, international, in tackling such an important topic. The other topic, which is important, and where here we saw a raise in the number of volunteers, and that's thanks to the civil society. The state alone cannot handle such a pandemic. So with the civil society, the role of it became more important to coordinate, curate that work of volunteers, either here in helping at the entry of hospitals, either helping the security around the confinement, in curating, in talking to the citizens, in explaining, kind of the civil society being a tool between the big players, the state, WHO, and the citizens, in curating the message, but also in making sure that the communities are well informed, well behaving, so that we can end this pandemic as soon as possible. Those are two examples of many that shows the crucial and important and growing role of the civil society. And it's important also to note that the civil society and many big funders stopped their fundings during the pandemic. Everyone is looking at the next economic crisis, so the funds are not available, and that didn't stop the civil society, the volunteers, for being on the front row in tackling the pandemics, either by 3D printing shields for medical workers, in again campaigns to fight the fake news, in curating the information, in being there for citizens mentally, psychologically, and sometimes even financially, with the people that are losing their jobs. And we saw so many initiatives around the world of civil society in helping, especially the paycheck people that are suffering the most from this situation.
Absolutely. I don't know if any of you wants to build up on that.
Yes, I agree with Wadia, but I think that there are some important points that we should also add to this. I think we all agree that civil society has been always playing a crucial role during the times of crisis, but also most importantly in post-management, post-crisis management. We should also, well, this is because of the variety of reasons, right? Right. First of all, because they're more flexible. Secondly, because they have better networks and they know better the needs of the society. And also in the end, they don't need to very much come with public opinion, because in the end they are not policymakers. So they don't need to, calculate whether the actions will be understood positively or not by the society. So I think this is important. And when analyzing the reply of civil society, we should also make a division between more traditional, established civil society organizations and those more, ad hoc, spontaneous movements. Right? We saw during the global financial crisis in 2008, and also during the refugee crisis, so-called refugee crisis in 2015, a lot of spontaneous civil society movements, and we can see it here as well. So, as Wadia said, most of the actions here are based on volunteer actions, for instance, but also money raising. For instance, there have been a lot of, in Spain, online platforms created spontaneously by citizens to connect restaurants with hospitals and to help with food supply to the elderly people or people that cannot go out. And when it comes to traditional and more established CSOs, they, what most of them did is to use their networks and their contacts to help governments supply materials for hospitals, and also deploy their workforces to public hospitals. So yeah, this division is important to be made.
if I may also add on to that, I think Wadia and Alexandra have made very important points as to the role of civil society in a situation like we're experiencing globally. In Africa, we've seen, of course, similar efforts being coordinated, spearheaded, and in many cases led by civil society organizations, particularly because in many of the states, the issue of welfare services, social services is also sort of very limited in many of these countries. And so on the basis of that, you've seen civil society playing a leading role in mobilizing support from within the local organizations to support the work of government in many areas. What is also quite interesting is also the different individuals that have played that are playing very important roles. So if you look at the civil society broadly, you have civic actors who are the traditional individuals that we're very familiar with, but we're seeing increasingly the role of creatives who incidentally have been the ones that have been mostly affected by this crisis to a very large extent. But we've seen them deploying their creative abilities in many ways to support government's effort in sensitizing the citizens on the issue of COVID-19. But we've also seen the very interesting role that citizens journalists are playing in many of these instances. We've seen cases where citizens journalists are not only pointing out where there are not enough preparation in terms of isolation centers, test kits, and all of that, but also in calling sort of what I would call a naming and shaming of individuals who are, as we witnessed in Kenya, escaping the isolation centers to, because they said they cannot afford what it costs to be isolated and all of that. So you have citizens journalists also playing very interesting role in situations like this. Religious leaders have also been very helpful. And I mean, this is also very interesting because in many of the local African communities, religious leaders are seen as very huge influencers. And what they say oftentimes are regarded as law. And you've seen the role that many of them have played in ensuring that, their doctrinal services, don't take place as they used to do, but they're moving beyond just that to also providing welfare services through their networks, like Alexandra mentioned, but also in a way providing the little that they can to support governments in many areas to show up its facilities to respond to this pandemic. So it's been a potpourri of experiences, and I think that the civil society has once again, even though it's enduring all kinds of restrictions on the continent, has once again proved that it's not only there to antagonize, but it could also partner and collaborate with the government where necessary.
Thank you all for your input as well. I agree with everything that's been said, and I think that one other really important point is that the civil society is kind of coming in and taking the tone for where we're going for the future. So we're seeing governments and private sectors kind of setting the guidelines, but both here and also in my home country, the US, we're seeing the civil society kind of take up reins, and like you were saying about creatives, kind of illustrating the way that we can see the future and the way that we can create new ideas to move forward. So recently with my organization, Do Our Tech, we're actually working with youth from vulnerable areas in Morocco. And so one thing we did recently was host an internal hackathon. Partially it was really just to educate the youth about how they can be part of civil society and create new ideas. But also we truly want to hear what they have to say. And I think that the transparency that we're seeing between governments and the civil society is a really great way that we can see these new innovations popping up. I know, a lot of my work, frankly, is remote. I'm going from city to city. We have a decentralized hub. And so to see all these new innovations in remote work popping up at a time when I need it on a day-to-day is is really incredible to see what can be done when the public is coming together in the time of a crisis to move forward for a very different future, but hopefully a brighter one.
So just to build off that, Faye, we've seen either companies or civil society have adapted the situation with the use of different tools, whether they're digital tools or different types of tools to better connect with the populations that they're trying to assist, or just kind of adapt as well, because all of our workspaces have been disrupted to a certain extent by what's going on. So I don't know if you can tell us more about the types of tools that you use, and if if others here can perhaps pitch in on that as well, and let us know what types of tools are being used by civil society as a whole in order to achieve their goals.
Yeah, well, I can talk a little bit about that, because we're running 2 centers out of Fez and Saleh with 20 students at each. And so before COVID, we were coming in 2 days a week to do classes. Of course, that can't happen. So our partners were generous in giving laptops to our students to work from home, but we're working with vulnerable youth. So there's been an issue of connectivity and paying for connectivity, and how do you make solutions out of that. And so our teachers have been really admirable in kind of testing out different softwares. We've used almost every video conferencing software at this point, just to see what it looks like for our students and how we can make that happen. We're also using Google Classroom, and we have our own internal learning platform as well, that we're really ramping up in order to deploy for other organizations, so that we can get this distance learning content out to other people. Yeah, so, but it's been really incredible. I mean, we're seeing really great attendance levels, and the internal hackathon that we just did was a really awesome way to gain engagement from our students. They posted their ideas online. We're collaborating through Facebook, and sending videos back and forth. Like, it's very small things that can be done through social media. I'm seeing it through other entrepreneurial organizations in Morocco as well. There are people doing daily webinars just in order to have that face-to-face conversation that's missing so much from our lives.
If I may add to that as well, also about everyone has turned digital, right? Because there is no other way we can operate right now. Some interesting examples, for instance, are from organizations for women. There have been a lot of them, not only in Europe, but also in the Southern Mediterranean region, which is the region that I know best. That were, for instance, setting support lines for women that can be victims of violence. You know that because of the lockdown, there has been a sharp increase in domestic violence. So online platforms, online forums, and online and support lines. These are some of the examples, but also another one, which I think is equally interesting, is the way civil society organizations has been mobilizing and advocating, right? Because the world has not stopped. The governments are still adopting and also maybe using the opportunity to adopt some laws that can in the end be very dangerous and maybe also close the space for civil society to act. So for instance, we have seen civil society organizations adopting the way of protesting. And in Poland, due to the lockdown, people cannot go to the streets, but they can still move in their cars. So there have been a big protest of people inside the cars against the very restrictive law, anti-abortion law. And another important, interesting example is a recent protest in Israel, right? Where civil society gathered to protest against laws to be adopted by Netanyahu, and each person was respecting this rule to be 1 meter or 2 meters from another. So So there is this creativity, and I'm very curious what other creative ideas will happen during this lockdown in other countries.
Yeah. If I may add to that, I think that what we've also seen is that the use of technology, particularly emerging technologies, have also been quite varied. Of course, the very popular one is the way many of our social media platforms have been deployed for social engagement and mobilization towards the response to COVID-19. In addition to that is we've also seen quite a lot of innovation, particularly on the African continent, supporting issues around contact tracing in various countries, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya. We've also seen even deployment of non-technological based innovation like those that have been used in the days of Ebola in terms of deploying community volunteers to help with contact tracing for people who might have contracted COVID-19. We've also seen even far more sophisticated innovation being used, in countries like Senegal, where there is a collaboration between an organization in Senegal and, of course, another organization in the UK developing testing kits, locally in that country. So for us, really, there are quite this has been an interesting opportunity to sort of upgrade the conversation around digitalization on the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan part of Africa. I think now there is no need making any strong case anymore. The case has already been made by COVID on behalf of many people working in the digital space, that Africa needs to really get on board. We need to invest in infrastructure, and we need to invest in many of the innovation hubs that have been on the continent for many years now, innovating ideas to help them scale up these ideas and see how they can respond to the challenges we're facing with education, with social livelihoods for many people, as we see, but also in the governance space. The project that I work on supports the African Union. And at the moment, we working with the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention to deploy mass media messaging, because we also have to understand that when we talk about technology on the African continent, the penetration is still very limited. It's still roughly at about 34%. So there needs to be a balance between, the use of digital tools that are based on, smartphones, to also see how we can deploy non-digital methodologies that could help reach the most vulnerable in semi-urban and rural areas. And through a decentralized program, we are supporting quite a number of startups and civic groups in about 14, 15 countries at the moment. We're hoping to scale up over the next few weeks to about 30. And the idea basically is, how do we support these individuals to then deploy some, it could be digital, it could be non-digital, or mass messaging in various countries, basically to address three things. One, disbelief, because there's still a huge disbelief in many corners on the continent. People still think that this is some elitist kind of disease. It's for those who travel around the world. And so if you're cocooned in the corner of the village, you're shielded. But we've seen people moving from the urban areas to the villages, now transmitting also locally in those places. The second one is stigmatization, because we are also beginning to see people who have been cured of this being questioned in many areas and avoided, and all of that. So how do we deal with stigmatization? And the third is really, in many of the places where lockdowns have been implemented, how do people cope with this lockdown? So what kind of messaging do you provide to people to ensure that they are able to carry on with their life, and at least we do not have some kind of a COVID-19 PTSD to deal with in the long run. So those are kind of the examples of some of the innovations and the use of technology we're seeing on the continent.
I think it's important what has been mentioned, but also for the civil society, they were also part of those institutions that were hit in not seeing this coming, and were pushed to use the technologies and the digitalization. I think now, in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, where so many institutions are way ahead in artificial intelligence, machine learning, the civil society is not yet there. The use of those technologies are still superficial, and even to a bigger role, how can we make sure that COVID-19's pandemic is an opportunity for civil society to beef up their game in terms of technologies, and especially the governance of the fourth industrial revolution. When we talk about the governance of such technologies like drones, artificial intelligence, machine learning, on which values we are building those technologies, which frameworks we are using, and here yet we don't have the civil society representing the voice of the citizens, or representing that voice that cares for the community rather than the individual, that cares for the society rather than a shortcut to a business or to a law or a policy that the state wants to do. So for me is the civil society are now put in front of it, in front of the use of these technologies, because there is no other way, as it was mentioned. So how can we also push them to think of beyond the usage, beyond being the consumer of those technologies, to be kind of, why not, even the innovation and innovate for such technologies. And the use, for example, civil society have been using 3D printing to build the shields. The shields, it's not a business, it's not the state, it was the civil society people who innovated and built those shield masks for the health workers using 3D printing. So how can we, instead of having the civil society be the usual consumer or the usual institution that are on the defensive, to have them being part of the game and be part of that innovation and part of that governance and those discussions that are happening as we speak, and also after the pandemics?
That's a great question. maybe that could be the question for another debate. How can we carry on what we're learning, what we're seeing, all of these new dynamics that are coming about during this crisis? How can we carry them post-crisis as well? Whether it is civil society playing a greater role in the innovation process, in being part of the solution, which it already is, but in terms of the technology and the innovation side. And how can we carry on all of these different lessons as well, post-crisis, and post recovery phase and beyond. And I was wondering if you are seeing beyond the technology and the innovation side, if you are witnessing, or if you have any experience of trends that we are witnessing right now that can be carried on post-crisis, with regards to civil society, of course. Maybe new opportunities or new ways of doing things, and that will go beyond just the crisis response, but things that we can maybe see, that we can carry on for a greater amount of time.
For me, definitely there is a post-COVID-19 in the way how we work, how we live, and how we interact with each other. Now, who has the duty to frame those new standards? It should not be only the state, or it should not be only the business. Here there is a big role for the civil society, because civil society is bringing, as I said, like the mindset of the collective, especially that the majority of civil society in the world are volunteers. So if you are giving them your time and you are having the passion and you are engaged, you're not doing it for yourself mostly, you're doing it for the collective. So how can we bring that collective in framing, in delivering, in building up the new world order, being it political, being it economic, being it social? We know we were not going to be having packed offices. There is no way that it will happen after the COVID-19. So a lot of people will be working from home. What are the norms? A lot of people will have more time, because if we take the commuting time, what are those people doing with their time? If we don't give them alternatives, they will spend them in front of the TV. But how can the civil society step up to show things that can be done? Because we know that the state cannot do things alone. So how can we bring the people to be part of the action, to be actionable projects, initiatives that can be launched by the civil society?
if I may add to that, of course, it's important for civil society to adapt and to be innovative. This is the new trend that will certainly appear, switching to digital, using more digital tools, but which may, on the other hand, also leave some people behind. And it is definitely not in agreement with sustainable development goals, right? But an important role here should be played by donors. Most of the civil society organizations, traditional organizations, depend on public funding, and this public funding is not flexible, does not allow very much for innovative, creative actions, but rather is based on, you know, more established way of working. So I understand that an important role here is for civil society to advocate for this change, but governments also should understand the key role civil society is playing and to act on their side to adapt those tools and this funding in order to be able to address the crisis in a better way in the future. So.
I think from my point of view, there are about 3, 4, or 4 trends that we're seeing that will require a bit more reflection and, you know, engagement on the part of civil society going forward. I think one for me is the entire conversation around state civil society relations. What we have seen with many of the things that have happened is that civil society, to some extent, have been able to show its agility in responding, under very difficult circumstances, you know, and provide some kind of alternative ideas around how things can work. And I think that that is an example of the value that civil society brings on the table. For so long, particularly in this part of the world, on the African continent, I mean, the relationship between state and civil society organizations have been very combative. And that, to a very large extent, has led to, this kind of standoffish relationship between both parties. I think going forward, there needs to be a lot more engagement around how can we collaborate with state actors to, you know, address many of the challenges that we face, because we've seen quite a lot of them, you know, rearing their head in this crisis. You know, how do we deal with the challenge of a lack of a widespread social welfare system? You know, where when you shut down an economy that is largely informal, there are no means of ensuring that you can provide for these individuals. So you have to grapple with a spreading pandemic, but also grapple with citizens who are hungry and angry at the same time. So these conversations need to happen, and they are conversations that need to happen in a convivial, environment, which I think for me is very important. The second is collectivism. And I think Wadia did speak broadly about that. I see it at 2 levels. I think on the international stage, we've all seen that the issue around nationalism and that we are self-sufficient and can deal with our own problems our own way, if we just close the border or build a fence and all of it, we've seen that we need ourselves. We need everybody. We are all that we have. And so international collectivism in responding to a pandemic like this is very important. But it's also the same even at the local level, where we have to bring together, the various segment of the society, whether it is religious, whether it is social, whether it's economic, whether it's political, to sort of have a common understanding of the challenges that we face and to have a common way forward on how we address it. The third is really around some of the points that Wadia was also making on civil society engagement within the emerging technology space. I think we have no choice as it is right now. These technologies have come to stay. Civil society has been largely missing in many of the conversations around the governance, around the ethics and values of these emerging technologies, but also largely around its application. And that is where I think that in the post-COVID economy and world that we are looking forward to, there needs to be a lot more engagement around how do we ensure that these technologies do provide, succor to the largest population of the world that is very poor. I think that is where we need to put a lot, and civil society has a lot of role to play. in this area. I'm a governance person, so it would be remiss of me not to speak about accountability. There has been a lot of funds committed to COVID response. Many would come. I think that civil society has a huge role to play in ensuring that these resources are channeled to what they are meant for and do not end up in another kind of scandal where, you know, the poorest of the poor continue to suffer COVID-19. But some people begin to then feed fat on, you know, the influx of resources that would come or that we're already seeing in some instances around the world. I think that these are very important. I mean, I'm very passionate, really, particularly on the African continent around social welfare systems. It is really disheartening what you're seeing in many countries where citizens are coming on the screens to complain about not having, you know, just a meal a day. Schools are closed, so many of the school feeding programs are closed. And children can't feed, so you have a huge challenge with malnourishment coming up. You have a huge challenge with, you know, unemployed people in a system that you already have that. So there is quite a lot that we need to begin to reflect on what a post-COVID-19 era would look like and the role of society.
Just to go back to the point that you were making about state civil society relations, we know that the effectiveness of a government's response to stop the spread of the disease really depends on the trust of its citizens. And I was wondering, I'd like to have your thoughts on the role that civil society is playing in deepening the engagement between states and citizens. Is it placing itself, I mean, civil society organizations, are they placing themselves between the state, between the government and between citizens to help build that trust again as a, you know, as a middle person, trying to restore maybe some of the trust that was lost throughout the years between certain governments and its citizens? What's the role of civil society organizations within that space?
I mean, very good question, and there are no easy answers to it because on the continent, as you know, well, there is a very huge distrust of the government in itself, of the state, but there is also to some extent a distrust by the citizens of many of the civil society organizations as well. So it's a multi-level distrust, and while yes, to a very large extent, some of these organizations and some of these groups, and that is why I rather look at civil society in its broad form, to look at where citizens in themselves sort of see some level of legitimacy and respect, you know, the voices and the role played by individuals. For example, the faith-based organization. I think to a very large extent, there is still a huge level of trust that citizens have in faith-based organizations. So you've seen religious leaders now stepping in to help ensure that, messages being provided. Because see, even if you look at some of the challenges we're facing at the moment, in many countries where there are lockdowns, government have mostly been implementing these lockdowns from a security point of view, using armies and police. And just a few days ago, there was a report in a particular country I wouldn't like to mention, where, you know, there was an analysis about more people have been killed by security officers than the virus in itself. So you would have challenges like this cropping up. However, you're absolutely right that civil society in its pristine form does have a role to play in ensuring that they help as a middleman, as an interlocutor for the government in many of the instances to address these challenges. There are good examples, and I think that that is a point to be made. There are very many examples of society organizations that have stood up in support of efforts of the state and of the citizens in sort of ensuring that the challenges that citizens face on their own side is addressed. However, I think that this also presents an opportunity, and I think that that's the point that Wadia and Alexandra were making earlier about the fact that this presents us a very huge opportunity to begin to reflect around, citizens and civil society relations, but also state civil society relations on the other side, to sort of rebuild that trust and then ensure that we begin to, meet people at the point of their needs, to say it in a colloquial way, because really the challenge really is that citizens do not think, to some extent, that many of the society organizations, represent their voices, and they're mostly, just, also fending for themselves. So this is something that requires a lot more reflection. I imagine that it's a whole webinar on itself, going forward.
Yeah, if I may add to that, I agree with Ibrahim. If it of course depends on the country, but in Europe, especially in Central Eastern Europe, but also in the US, I believe there has been this growing mistrust in traditional civil society organizations that, which were judged to be too elitist, also accused of overspending on salaries of the employees and not enough spending on the needs of the real people. So there is this growing maybe threat to the traditional big international civil society organizations that either they should adapt and change their way of working, or they simply will lose ground to smaller local grassroots organizations. So I think that this trust should be rather, will be maybe rebuilt, and the role, more important role, will be played by local small civil society organizations.
I think for me, it's important that we are discussing the trust word in its globality, also vis-a-vis the civil society. For me, trust is a prerequisite for leadership. And if we see a leadership crisis in trusting either the institution, the state, or the civil society, as Ibrahim mentioned, for me, that's a lack of leadership from these institutions. And when we talk about trust, if we talk about trust, it means no fear. And the fear from institutions, unfortunately, in many countries is still there. So I cannot trust an institution that I fear, being it civil society or being it the state. So in such a time of pandemic, where it's important to have that trust to be able to follow the recommendations of an institution like the state, if there is no trust from the citizen to the state, and there is a chance for civil society to play that intermediary, that's good. But the problem is when you have also no trust in the civil society as well. And those, again, for me, as I said, is a prerequisite of leadership. And when we say what undermines the trust, it's lack of integrity, unfair treatment, as Ibrahim said, like when you have more death by the police rather than the virus, it's saying bullshit and lying, lack of authenticity. And those are all qualities of leadership. And the pandemic is unfortunately also shedding the light about that leadership crisis that we have in so many countries, being it in the institution of the state, being it in the business sector, being it in the civil society themselves. When we have the same leader for 40 years and looking for funding and saying, I'm an association with no democracy, with no governance, with nothing, of course, then we will have a big problem of trust. And then the citizens will not be following the simple recommendation, even if it's coming from civil society.
I think there's also something to say about whether civil society is reaching all of the people that really need the services. I know from my experience living in a very rural area, I was in a place where civil society didn't, they didn't come. I was there for 2 years, and there was maybe one organization that showed up to offer services or to engage the people. And so there's a real opportunity in the growth of digitization and everything like this. But if the infrastructure doesn't exist, and if the reach isn't to those people who truly need it, then they're left out of the conversation entirely. And so I think that civil society has a huge role to play in making the effort to reach out to those marginalized populations that truly need it, whether it's domestic violence, like Alexandra was talking about earlier, or the new way that people will be employed. We're talking about remote work, but entire industries could change too. if those industries don't include marginalized groups, then how's that going to look in terms of protests for employment and falling back on how we're moving into this next industrial revolution.
I also wanted to highlight that we've seen also a surge of solidarity, whether here in Morocco, at least, just speaking from this local context, we've seen whether it's individuals, so citizens, or CSOs contributing to the general effort in a surge of solidarity. And I think that's something that we really hadn't seen, at least not to this extent before. Rapid mobilization of people, of volunteers, trying to reach the most underserved as well in terms of providing them with food baskets or making sure that they are getting access to the education programs that they need to follow along with in order to pass their exams at the end of the school year. I think there's a lot of different actions that are led by civil society organizations that are fueled with a lot of solidarity. And I think that this solidarity is perhaps rebuilding the trust that we need between citizens and CSOs and civil society organizations, and maybe to a larger extent with the state as well, who has been intervening in a very broad way and making very efficient and very well-targeted approaches to help us deal with this crisis. So I don't know if we still have time. I think we do. So maybe one last question before wrapping it all up. Just broadly speaking, what do you think? What are we learning about civil society's role in crisis management in general? We are clearly going through a very large crisis at the world level, at the global level. And we're seeing that civil society is really stepping up. Not that it wasn't before, but that is playing a really important role, and that really we need civil society in order to make things happen. So in your opinion, what are we seeing as the main role for civil society in crisis management overall?
If I may, I wanted to just tackle briefly the solidarity that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I am rather negative about whether this solidarity will remain post-crisis. I have the impression that we are jumping from crisis to crisis, and of course some people are, helping others because this is their core business, and simply because they're good persons, but other people are simply following social trends. So I'm just wondering whether this will, and we cannot expect of everyone to be as an activist, right? So I'm just wondering whether this will lead us, and whether some of those social movements that are emerging right now to help others will convert into stable movements that will change the politics in the long term or not. This is just, the thing that is now occupying a bit my mind. But when it comes to, I forgot the question.
Oh, I was just saying, what are we learning about the role of civil society in crisis management in general?
Yeah. To me, the most important role that is being played is provide information. This is the first thing that Wadia said at the beginning. So this is something that civil society has been doing for years, and it's very important, collecting data and informing citizens, and also holding governments into account and advocates. So advocacy, information, and this is something that will remain, I think, and maybe even become a stronger line of action of civil society organizations.
Right.
For me, I think what's important is, the role of civil society is growing and will grow more. One thing, we need to make sure that we grow in quality, not in quantity, because also a lot of people and everyone wants to be the head, the founder, the CEO, the president of of an association or an NGO. And we need to move beyond the individual to think of the collective. Like the last statistics I checked, for example, for Morocco, in 2016, we had 130,000 associations. If we divide that by the 30 million or 35 million people we have, that's an association for every 350 people. It's nonsense. So how can we make sure we go around the serious associations or civil society in general in the broader term? How can we make sure we back them up? And backing up is not telling them what to do, is to give them the platform where they can thrive, where they can shine, where they can do actions, and not to have a top-down mechanism to tell them what to do or what not to do. So I think for me, those two are very important so that we can make sure that the role of the civil society in its broader term is up to the standards and up to the challenges that we are going in.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, two things as well. And one is to respond to the comment you made about solidarity, but also to then link that to the point around civil society. For me, solidarity, particularly on the African continent, has been something that we throw around and give all kinds of fancy, nice outlook, you know, because it is ingrained in our culture. It's a cultural value for us. However, what we have not seen enough of that is the translation of this cultural value into a state value. You know, where is the solidarity from the state structures, you know, towards the citizens? Oftentimes what citizens want and oftentimes what they get from civil society is presence. You know, where's the presence of the state in the life of average citizens? Is the state listening to the citizens? Many of the society organizations in their pristine form, you know, listen, you know, they understand the challenges that the citizens face and they're able to provide, even if it's just listening to them, they're able to provide that. The third for me is showing empathy. You know, where is the empathy of the state? You know, when you lock down and there are no provisions, or even when the provisions are made, it is not provided in a way that citizens, you know, feel respected. And I think that for me, that solidarity needs to translate from not just a cultural value, but it must become a state value. It must be something that is part and parcel of our governance process on the continent. In terms of what that means for civil society going forward, I think largely for me is to piggyback on the point that Alexandra made. Civil society will continue to become relevant. It will become very important going forward. However, we need to take advantage of the momentum that has been gained from this COVID-19 response to then use that to push for systemic change in our governance system, particularly on the African continent. And I know it's the same globally as well. But particularly here, this is the time to use the opportunity of this COVID-19 to make very strong demands on our health management systems on the continent, the health governance systems. It is the time to leverage on these to, you know, move some kind of a continental agenda around welfare systems for citizens. For me, on the economic front, it is the time to actually discuss very elaborately, you know, how do we transition to a very large extent many of our informal businesses into the formal, because states, as we see with the economic crisis that we're facing now, states would actually have need for more tax reforms and all of that. And this can only happen when you have many of these people under the tax bracket. But if 60, 70% of your people are in the informal business sector and all of that, how do you do that? So all commodity prices are down. You do not have an efficient tax reforms and all of that. Your health system is strained because of COVID-19. I think you know, I'm not one for gloom, but the signs are not very good, and I think that civil society has a huge role to play in signposting all of these challenges that we face.
Faye, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I don't know if I can follow up with that response. It was quite thorough. But I mean, I totally agree with the points, and I think that as an American living in Morocco, it's kind of an interesting point that I'm sitting on, you know, I'm watching my home country kind of break down these solidarity efforts that have been built up for years and years through government administrations, and the civil society is trying to remind them that these things are in place, and the government is looking to those leaders to remember what has been going on for years. And then in the contrast in Morocco, the government's response has been very strong. And I think it's been really incredible to be a resident here and to see all of the citizens come together for this greater cause, both to protect themselves, but also as a solidarity effort for sure. But then, like Ibrahim was saying, where does civil society go from here? You know, there's so much transparency going on, and there's so much room for growth. But it has to be carried on. So we'll see what happens.
For sure, only time will tell. But actually, before we close this, I have one more question for Wajia. Because Wajia, other than being the head of the Global Shapers at the World Economic Forum, and just to remind everyone, we're speaking of a community of over 10,000 young leaders in more than 150 countries. You are also a big proponent for dialogue and experience sharing for greater impact, and a very big supporter of youth and youth action. So I just wanted to ask you, what has youth been doing to counter the effects of this pandemic? I know that you're in touch with the Global Shaper community, that you've been seeing a lot of their efforts in their local communities. And I'm just curious to know if you would like to, if you could share some of the things that you've seen, and also in your capacity as head of the Global Shapers.
Sure. I mean, I'm so proud and humbled by the response of Shapers across the world to COVID-19. I mean, since the first days, and the Global Shapers, for those who don't know it, it's a community of young people around the world that are from all walks of life. So we have doctors, health workers, to teachers, students, unemployed, and so on and so forth. So and the beauty is to have everyone come around and talk and discuss and say, like, what can we do before going and engaging and jumping to do something that is not the right response. It's to take time to pause and say, what's the most needed now in terms of actions, and where can we help? So, and thanks to the work also of the World Economic Forum in tandem with the WHO, one of the first pain points was that the materials that is available on COVID-19 is on the 5 UN official languages. So how can we make sure that we translate the information to Hindi, to Kiswahili, to languages, to people that don't understand English or French or Arabic or Chinese? So that was the first pain point that we found, which we started to work on. The other point is talking about solidarity. We saw that at the beginning of this crisis in January, a lot of media and a lot of people were calling coronavirus China virus. So how to make sure we're also working on the mindset? It's not a China virus. People were like walking down from Chinese restaurant thinking that they will get the virus. So how can we educate people with simple messages? So those are kind of the actions that the Shapers have been doing since January. Here we're talking about January before it reaches out the whole world. And since then, the action like not doubled, but went exponential to more than 100 hubs around the world, tackling projects that are dealing directly with COVID-19. For example, the Rome Hub, they created a platform where you as a citizen, you can book in a restaurant post-COVID-19, like in 2021, but you pay now. So you give cash to the restaurant so that they don't close, they don't go bankrupt. How can we help with smart ideas like that in bringing that solidarity around? You know, people were reaching out. Yesterday we had a call, and Shapers from China, like, I have contacts with some companies that have the protective material for health workers. If you need some in your country, let me know. Just having that solidarity at the international level beyond, helping your neighbor is very important and much needed, but it's not existent. I've seen shapers being locked down in some countries where they cannot even move. And then the solidarity happen internationally with contacting Minister of Foreign Affairs, head of states, so that we can help each other. So that solidarity for me now is how can we make it global? How can it go down to every citizen? Because at the end of the day, we are in the same earth. And if something happens, we are all in the same in the same place. So how can we make sure? I'm sure as human beings, we will go through the pandemic. What I'm not sure of is, are we writing history or not? Because pandemics, they were worse than this. The Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920, more pandemics like with millions of death. But are we gonna write history this time or not? So for me, that's the main question. And that's also where the civil society and young people, everyone, the citizens have a role to play. And it's one action at a time, but it's exponential when we multiply it to everyone.
Well, I think on that note, we can conclude this seminar on the role of civil society and civil society organizations in facing this pandemic. And I would just like to thank all of our speakers for helping us understand the extent of civil society's role in facing this pandemic, and also how CSO actions can look different in different parts of the world depending on local needs and the means available. There's a lot more to cover about this topic, and I think we may just have to hold another webinar to further delve into CSO action and how it can be carried out post-crisis as well. And I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us from the comfort of their home. And that too, to a very large extent, is helping the collective effort in facing this pandemic. And before closing off this webinar, I would just like to wish Ramadan Kareem to all of those observing this holy month. Stay safe, everyone, and stay tuned on the Policy Center's website for more publications, interviews, webinars, and videos. Thank you.